This is a quick demonstration of how to use your own functions in Delphi. Let's start by writing a program that calculates the factorial. Let's first explain what the word factorial means. Factorial of, for instance, 5 is 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. And factorial of 3 would, of course, be 3 times 2 times 1. So the definition of factorial is the product of all the positive integers from 1 to a given number. Let's get back to our question. Write a program that calculates the factorial of any positive integer smaller than 31 and prints this result on a label, or in our case on a panel. I've written the program already. You can see that here we have an edit and a label and a button which I called button btn calculate, and the panel on which I want to display the result of the calculation. Let's look at what this calculation looks like. You can see that it is a procedure and it belongs to the form, and the name of this procedure is button execute click. In other words, it is an event handler. Something has to happen. Someone has to click the button. I need a number of variables. I have I as an integer, temp num and factorial, and our program starts by making factorial equal to 1, because the smallest number of which I can calculate a factorial is 1. I've used a temporary variable, temp num, and it's equal to the value that is put into the edit box. So this must be converted to an integer, so I use the function string to int, and then a quick for do loop. For I, my counter, equaling 1 to temp num, this number that I've entered, do the following. Factorial is factorial times I. So initially factorial is 1, then factorial multiplied by I, which is also 1, which gives me 1. Then factorial becomes factorial times I, then I changes to 2, and factorial becomes factorial, which is 1 times 2, so the result is 2. Then I changes to 3, and I get 2 times 3. So this is calculating factorial correctly, and I'm producing output on the panel of the words the value of, the number that was entered, factorial is, and into string the value of factorial. Let's run this program and see what happens. If I enter 3, we know that 3 times 2 is 6, so the factorial value of 3 should be 6. That looks good. Let's try 4, so 4 must just be 4 times 6, because it's 4 times 3 factorial, and that is 24. So 5 must be 5 times 4 times 3 times 2, which is 120. So our program works correctly. However, the instruction was to change this program to make use of a user-defined function. Now the implication is that there are other sorts of functions, and we've used them already. If you look at string to int, for example, that is an example of a function that is not user-defined. It's part of Delphi and we can use it. However, now we want to create a function that we've written ourselves and that does exactly what we want it to do. A function is a sub-program. In other words, it's a few lines of code that we can execute on demand. Let's write our function above the event handler for the button. I'm going to put it over here. And the way we do it is to say function and the name of the function, factorial. It makes sense to call it that. And then it needs a parameter, some value that is entered into this function with which it must do the calculation. In other words, of which it must find the factorial. And notice the second part. The function factorial has num as input, but it itself is a variable type, and in this case a variable of type integer. This function is going to have some local variables, and let's give it I and temp factorial, and they are also integers, begin and end, and between these two we're going to write the body of the code for the function. Let's scroll down and look at the calculations that we did in the past. There are lines of code here in the event handler which I can cut out of the button and put into my function and then call the function. We need the initial value of factorial, we need a temp num, and we need the loop, and we need the contents of the loop. So let's drag all of this up to my function and do some spacing. I need to adjust my variable names. I don't have a factorial variable in the function. It's called temp factorial, so let's change its name, temp factorial. My loop runs from for I equaling 1 to num, not temp num, in other words this value over here. Do and temp factorial is equal to temp factorial times I. So what have we done so far? We've taken some of the code that the button executes every time, and I put it in a subprogram called factorial, and this subprogram is a function. Our function has some input, the number of which I want to calculate the factorial, and our function is itself a variable, and in this case of type integer. Our program then starts the same as it used to, with a temporary variable equal to 1. This line of code I don't need in the function, because this should be used to get the value that's inside the edit and store it into a temp num variable. So this must go back where it came from. Temp num must get the value from the edt num.text on the form. So now our function has a temporary variable called temp factorial, which I make equal to 1, and then my loop runs from my counter equaling 1 to num, the value entered there. Let's make them look the same. And temp factorial is temp factorial times I. And ultimately I must send back a value in the name of the function. So let's send it back as follows. Factorial, that's the name of the function, colon equals temp factorial. This looks good. My function looks as if it will work now. Let's go back to our procedure that would call the function. Once again, I get the value that has been entered into the edit box, and I store it into a temporary variable. My panel now produces the output of the value of the number that's been entered. Factorial is into string factorial. So this is where I call my function. That name is exactly the same as factorial over there, except that the subprogram, the function factorial, must have a value as input. It must know what value to calculate the factorial for. So in this case, that value must be temp num. Let's compile and run our program. We have an error. Let's see why. Missing operator or semicolon. Now let's see, where does this error come from? I see the word factorial here. That is the name of our function. But I also have a factorial variable over here, and I can't have two variables of the same name. So let's remove this local variable in the button, as well as that comma, and run my program again. And now it compiles. Let's put in an integer. Try 5, press calculate, and the value of 5 factorial is 120. Let's go back and see again exactly what this program does. My event handler, the button, has less code than it used to. It merely receives a value from the edit box, and then it starts the output line. Panel output.caption is all these words, and then into string factorial temp num. Now this is where our user-defined function is called. Always write your function above the calling procedure. Function factorial, it needs some input, the value of which it must calculate the factorial, and it itself must be a variable of type integer. It can of course be string or any of the other variable types that you are used to. I need some temporary variables. I is my counter, and temp factorial is the value that I'm going to use to calculate factorial right until the end, before I make it equal to the name of the function. So I use a temporary variable, in this case temp factorial, and I assign temp factorial, once I've completed my calculation, to the name of the function factorial. I hope this helps you to understand functions a little bit better.